6:14 a.m. Vinton County, Ohio, March 17, 2026. The farmhouse at the end of the gravel drive looked exactly like every other weathered two-story in this part of rural Appalachian Ohio. Peeling white paint, a rusted weather vane, an overgrown hedgerow running along the east side of the property. Nothing that would make a person slow down. The tactical team was already on the porch. 16 agents, plus 4 Ohio State Highway Patrol officers and 2 Homeland Security Investigation specialists, stacked in 2 columns against the exterior wall. No flashbangs, no loudspeaker commands. The team leader, a supervisory special agent out of the FBI's Cincinnati field office, referred to in case documents as Agent Caldwell, gave a single hand signal. The deadbolt punched inward. The door opened without a sound. What they found inside that farmhouse, behind a false pantry wall, through a hinged bookshelf, in a windowless back room, became the subject of a 240-page federal report. It started with a post-it note. 42 days before the raid, a rural mail carrier named Patricia Voss was finishing the last loop of her Route 12 assignment. She had driven this stretch of MacArthur Road hundreds of times. The farms blurred together in January. Frozen fields, ice-coated mailboxes, the same dogs barking at the same fence corners. Voss knew this road the way you know a road you've driven for 11 years. Not consciously. In your hands. In the small adjustments you make before you've thought to make them. She knew which driveways had bad gravel. She knew which mailboxes sat crooked and had to be pushed shut. She knew the light at different times of day and the way ice formed on the north side of the blacktop before it formed anywhere else. But something at the 2-story on the hill stopped her. The mailbox was jammed with unread pizza flyers. A week's accumulation, maybe more. Voss knew that farmhouse had people in it. The lights were on at odd hours. The driveway was used. Someone was home. But the trash bins at the end of the gravel drive told a different story. 2 large blue bins, both overflowing. And what they contained caught her eye long enough that she pulled her postal vehicle off the road and sat for a moment. Dozens of empty plastic milk jugs. Off-brand cereal boxes stacked in uniform flattened rows, the kind of organized compaction you only see when someone has had a lot of them to deal with. Juice cartons. Large institutional cans. The kind that come from a restaurant supply context, not a grocery store. Not the waste pattern of a couple. Not even a large family in the conventional sense. Voss had been delivering mail in Vinton County for 11 years. She knew what ordinary rural household waste looked like. A family of 4 generated a predictable volume, a predictable mix. 2 adults in a farmhouse, which was what the county records would have shown, generated even less. What she was looking at was different in character, not just volume. The uniformity of it nagged at her. The cereal boxes were all the same brand. The cans were all the same size. It had the quality of procurement, not shopping. Like someone buying for a function, not for a household. She didn't call anyone. She didn't report it online. She grabbed a yellow post-it note from the stack she kept in the glove box for address corrections, wrote down the property number, a brief description of what she'd seen, and dropped it at the Vinton County Sheriff's substation on her way back to the depot. The deputy who took it thanked her and set it on the desk. For 72 hours, the post-it sat there. Then a sheriff's investigator named Whitmore, cross-checking rural property concerns as part of a regional welfare program review, noticed it. He ran the address through the county property system and called the FBI's Cincinnati field office. That phone call changed everything. The Cincinnati field office had an active Child Exploitation Task Force. It had been running for 3 years, coordinating with Homeland Security investigations, the Ohio State Highway Patrol, and county sheriff departments across southeastern Ohio. The task force supervisor, referred to in documents as Supervisory Special Agent Mercer, took the call on a Wednesday morning in late January. Mercer listened. Address: rural property. Anomalous waste volume. No prior complaints on file. He asked one question: what's the utility draw at that address? Whitmore didn't know, but he found out. The utility usage data came back within 48 hours. What it showed stopped the investigation cold, then accelerated it. The property was registered to Roland Birch, a 56-year-old Vinton County resident who had owned the farmhouse since 2009. County records listed 2 adults, a married couple, no dependents, no school enrollment, no child welfare services contact, nothing. But the electric usage curve for that property over the preceding 14 months looked nothing like a 2-person household. A standard rural Ohio farmhouse with 2 adult occupants draws somewhere between 800 and 1,200 kilowatt-hours per month in winter. The Birch property was drawing 3,400 kilowatt-hours per month, consistently, every month for over a year. 3,400 kilowatt-hours. That number is consistent with a small dormitory, a licensed group home, a commercial kitchen running around the clock. It was not consistent with 2 adults in a farmhouse. Mercer pulled together a working group of 3 agents and requested an emergency records query through the Ohio Department of Education. How many children were enrolled in any school district within a 20-mile radius whose listed home address was the Birch property? The answer came back in 4 hours. 0. Not 1 child. Not homeschooled and registered. Not enrolled and transferring. Not flagged for truancy or welfare review. 0. The address had never appeared in any Ohio school enrollment database. 0 children registered. 3,400 kilowatt-hours per month. Trash bins that suggested a household of 20 or more. The strangest part about this case isn't the raid or even what agents found inside. It's that number, 3,400. Sitting in a utility database for 14 months, invisible, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Nobody had asked until Patricia Voss pulled over on MacArthur Road and looked at a trash bin. The task force opened a formal federal investigation on February 2, 2026. Case file designation, classified. Within 72 hours, Mercer had authorized passive surveillance on the property. 2 agents in a nondescript pickup truck ran daylight observation passes on MacArthur Road every morning between 6 and 9 a.m. for the first 10 days. They drove different vehicles on alternating days. They varied their departure times by 15 to 20 minutes to avoid establishing a recognizable pattern. They used long-lens cameras mounted inside the cab, shooting through tinted glass, logging timestamps and activity notes in handwritten field journals that were then transcribed into the digital case file each evening. What they observed added weight to the anomaly. Deliveries. Not grocery store delivery. Bulk supply deliveries. A van from a restaurant supply wholesaler visited the property twice in the first 10 days of observation. No invoices were visible. The van was in and out in under 12 minutes each time. No one appeared at the front door to accept delivery. The driver used the side entrance near the barn. Agents noted that the barn side door, which showed light rust on the hinges consistent with infrequent use, was standing open when the van arrived, as though someone inside had opened it in advance. It was closed again within 2 minutes of the van's departure. On day 11, an agent photographed the supply van's plate. A subpoena to the wholesaler returned records showing the Birch property had been a customer account for over 2 years. Monthly orders, institutional quantities of dry goods, canned foods, and paper products. Enough food for a household of at least 15 to 20 people. Ordered consistently. Paid in cash on delivery. The investigation had its second data point. And its first obstacle. The problem was thermal imagery. To confirm occupancy numbers without physical entry, which required a warrant, which required probable cause beyond a utility curve and a supply van, the task force needed a drone thermal imaging run over the property. Thermal imaging could detect body heat signatures through walls, giving agents a rough count of occupants. The request went to the FBI's Aerial Support Unit in Columbus. The response came back. The thermal imaging drone was deployed to a separate federal operation in western Ohio and wouldn't be available for 14 days. 14 days. The investigation was already on day 11. Mercer made a decision. He contacted an HSI aerial unit in Cleveland. Homeland Security Investigations had its own drone assets. The HSI unit could have a thermal-capable platform over the property within 48 hours, but only if the FBI formally transferred primary jurisdiction on the aerial component to HSI for the imaging operation. Mercer signed the paperwork that afternoon. The joint FBI-HSI structure that would eventually execute the raid began in a bureaucratic necessity on day 11 of a 72-hour investigation. On February 14, 2026, at 4:11 a.m., an HSI thermal drone completed a low-altitude pass over the Birch property. The drone flew a pre-programmed grid pattern at an altitude of 300 feet, low enough to capture meaningful thermal resolution through the farmhouse's roof and exterior walls, high enough to remain inaudible from the ground. The entire pass took 9 minutes. The operator, sitting at a mobile command terminal inside a panel van parked 7/10 of a mile north of the property on MacArthur Road, watched the feed in real time. The imaging team in Cleveland processed the data and transmitted the report to Cincinnati by 6:30 a.m. 16 heat signatures, concentrated in the northwest quadrant of the structure's ground floor, clustered, not distributed throughout the house the way adults in a normal household would be. Clustered, close together, in a single zone. 16 signatures. 2 adults were visible in the kitchen area on the thermal image, consistent with 2 people awake and moving in an early morning routine. The other 14 signatures were grouped in a small rear section of the ground floor that didn't appear on the property's original building permit documentation. A room that, officially, didn't exist. One detail stuck in the after-action report. The thermal signature cluster was low to the floor. Adult height heat signatures show a specific vertical spread on thermal imaging. These signatures were compressed. Small. Close to the ground. Mercer read that line in the thermal report and requested a federal search warrant the same morning. The warrant application went to the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Ohio. The supporting affidavit ran 41 pages. Utility data, supply records, postal observation, aerial thermal imaging results, and the school enrollment query. A federal magistrate judge signed the warrant at 2:17 p.m. on February 16th. The task force had authorization to enter. What came next required patience most people couldn't imagine. Here's what most people assume about federal raids. Once you have a warrant, you go in. You move fast. You execute. You're done. The reality in a case like this is the opposite. You slow down. Because when victims are inside, not suspects and not contraband, but actual people, the first obligation is making absolutely certain that when you breach, no one gets hurt. That requirement added 29 days to the timeline. The task force spent those 29 days building a 3-dimensional picture of the interior layout. They obtained original building plans from the Vinton County Recorder's Office. The house had been built in 1951 and substantially renovated in 2003. They cross-referenced the thermal imaging data with the building plans and identified where the unofficial room had to be. The northwest quadrant of the ground floor, according to the original plans, contained a kitchen, a utility corridor, and a pantry. The thermal signature cluster was in the pantry zone, but the cluster was too deep, too far from the exterior wall, to match the pantry dimensions shown in the plans. There was additional space behind the pantry, unregistered, unventilated by any duct shown on the plans. A room built after the last permitted renovation, invisible to every county database, accessible only from inside. A structural engineer contracted by the FBI, operating under a confidentiality order, reviewed the plans and the thermal data. The conclusion: given the thermal signature depth and the building geometry, the access point to the hidden room was almost certainly concealed within the pantry itself. A hinged panel, a false wall, a bookshelf or cabinet mounted on a pivot. Agents rehearsed the entry sequence 17 times in a mock-up built inside a Cincinnati warehouse using measurements from the building plans. The mock-up was constructed over a weekend using plywood and 2x4s. It was rough. No insulation, no flooring, but dimensionally accurate to within 4 inches. Agents walked the breach pattern until they could do it without thinking. They trained for what they would find. They trained for what they would need to do the moment they got through. They also trained for what to say, or more precisely, what not to say. The protocol for a room containing traumatized children is different from any other scenario in federal tactical training. No commands, no raised voices. Physical containment of the adults in the household first. Silence once the room was open. The first agent through the concealed access point was not to advance, not to sweep the room with a weapon, not to issue any instruction. She was to stop, lower herself to a non-threatening posture, and wait. That agent was identified in case documents as Agent Rourke. The Child Welfare Convoy, 9 Ohio DCFS caseworkers, 2 pediatric nurses, and 4 support vehicles, was positioned 1 mile down MacArthur Road by 5:45 a.m. on the morning of March 17th. They had been waiting in the pre-dawn cold for 40 minutes by the time the tactical team made entry. In the days between the warrant signing and the raid, the investigation developed one additional thread that has received almost no public attention. A federal financial analyst assigned to the task force ran a review of Roland Birch's known banking activity over the preceding 3 years. What emerged was not a complex money laundering architecture. It was almost the opposite. A deliberate, sustained effort to conduct every transaction in cash, at amounts and intervals specifically calibrated to remain below the federal currency transaction reporting threshold. The pattern was consistent, methodical, practiced. The cash withdrawals corresponded in timing and approximate amount to the wholesale food delivery schedule. Someone was paying for those deliveries with money drawn from an account in amounts that wouldn't automatically trigger a federal flag. The analyst flagged this as evidence of financial awareness. Not sophistication, but awareness. Whoever was running the Birch operation understood, at a functional level, that certain dollar amounts attracted scrutiny and had structured their activity accordingly. The analyst's report identified 2 other individuals whose accounts showed similar cash withdrawal patterns in proximity to the supply delivery dates. One of those individuals was the 4th adult found at the kitchen table on the morning of the raid. The other was the 5th individual, the unapprehended associate referenced later in the case documents, whose account had gone dormant approximately 4 months before the raid. Dormant. Not closed. Dormant. That distinction would become significant later. Mercer gave the order at 6:14 a.m. The breach took 11 seconds. Deadbolt punched. Door open. 2 columns entering simultaneously. One moving toward the kitchen, where thermal imaging had shown the adult signatures, one moving directly for the pantry. 4 adults, Roland Birch, a woman identified in court records as his wife, and 2 other individuals identified as the wife's parents, were seated at the kitchen table eating pancakes when the agents came through the door. They were handcuffed without resistance. Not one of the 4 said a word. That detail, the silence, is noted in the after-action report not as incidental, but as operationally significant. Agents trained to read resistance scenarios note that people who stay silent at the moment of arrest have typically rehearsed that silence. The 4 adults at the table didn't look at each other. They didn't look toward the pantry. They looked at their hands. The second column reached the pantry in under 30 seconds. The false wall was exactly where the structural engineer had said it would be. A floor-to-ceiling shelving unit loaded with canned goods, mounted on a concealed hinge mechanism. One of the agents found the release latch in under a minute. The shelf swung outward. Behind it, a windowless room, roughly 12 feet by 14 feet, insulated with acoustic foam, lit by a single battery-powered lantern. And 16 children, ages ranging from 2 to 11 years old, who had never been enrolled in any school, never appeared in any database, living in that room for a period investigators would later describe in the after-action report as ranging from several months to, in some cases, multiple years. The lead agent who entered the room, identified in documents only as Agent Rourke, later described in her sworn statement what she encountered in the first 30 seconds. No screaming, no crying. 16 pairs of eyes, looking up, in silence. Some of the younger ones had moved toward the back wall, not toward the door, away from it. They didn't know if the open door meant safety or something else. Rourke knelt down. She didn't shout commands. She didn't reach for anything. She sat down on the floor of that room, crossed her legs, and waited. One small figure, later identified in case records only as Emma, age 6, stepped forward from the group. She looked at Rourke for a long moment. Then she pointed at the doorway, where pale early morning light was visible through the farmhouse's kitchen windows. "Is that real?" Emma asked. Rourke said yes. Emma asked if she was allowed to look at the sun. That exchange, 4 words from a 6-year-old who apparently hadn't seen direct sunlight in long enough that she needed permission to look at it, appears verbatim in the federal after-action report. It appears verbatim because Agent Rourke requested that it be included. It's the only non-procedural language in 240 pages of documentation. The child welfare convoy was called forward at 6:31 a.m. Caseworkers and pediatric nurses entered the property within 7 minutes. All 16 were brought out through the front door, into the pale March morning, wrapped in blankets carried from the support vehicles. While the caseworkers moved the children to the support vehicles, evidence processing teams began their systematic work inside the farmhouse. The hidden room was photographed from every angle before anything was touched. Agents documented the sleeping arrangements. Thin foam pads laid side by side on the concrete floor, covered with institutional fleece blankets of the same color and size, uniform in the way that items are uniform when they've been purchased in bulk for a purpose, rather than accumulated over time. A plastic bin in the corner contained children's clothing, sorted by approximate size. Another bin held shoes, paired and stacked. The organization of it was meticulous. Not the chaos of neglect, the order of control. The battery lantern in the center of the room was the only light source. There were no books, no toys in any conventional sense. There were several hand-assembled puzzles made from cut cardboard, crude, clearly made inside the room from packaging materials, and a small collection of smooth stones arranged in patterns on one of the foam pads. The stones had been sorted by color. The arrangement was careful. The forensic team bagged and tagged 214 individual items from the room over the course of 7 hours. Roland Birch and the 3 other adults were in federal custody by 6:40 a.m. They were transported to the Southern District of Ohio's federal detention facility. During the transport, none of the 4 spoke to each other. None spoke to the transporting agents beyond the standard booking exchange. The silence they had maintained at the kitchen table held through processing, through the preliminary detention hearing, through every documented interaction in the first 48 hours of custody. Their attorneys arrived within 6 hours of booking. The farmhouse was sealed as a federal crime scene by 7:15 a.m. The investigation was 85 days old. Put yourself in Supervisory Special Agent Mercer's position on the morning of February 2nd, sitting in that Cincinnati field office, holding a utility curve and a sheriff deputy's note about trash bins. No names. No complaint. No missing persons report. Nothing in any database that said there were children at that address, because nothing in any database acknowledged those children existed at all. The system hadn't failed to find them because of a gap in data collection. The system had failed because these children never entered the system in the first place. No birth records cross-referenced to this address. No pediatric healthcare claims. No welfare applications. Nothing. What haunted investigators throughout the 85-day case wasn't how Birch concealed the children from authorities. The answer was straightforward. They'd simply never registered them anywhere. What haunted investigators was the harder question: how much longer would this have continued if Patricia Voss hadn't looked at a trash bin? The existing child welfare system in rural Ohio and in rural counties across the country has a built-in blind spot. If a child is never registered with any system, no flag will trigger. No alert will sound. No welfare check will ever find them. The Birch property went undetected not because of sophisticated concealment. It went undetected because of paperwork that was never filed. That's not a law enforcement failure. That's a systemic one. Court records in the Southern District of Ohio show that federal prosecutors filed charges against Roland Birch and the 3 other adults under multiple federal statutes. The charges included conspiracy and federal child welfare violations. Federal prosecutors requested detention without bail at the initial hearing on March 18th. All 4 adults were remanded. In the weeks following the raid, federal agents conducted a series of formal interviews with individuals who had had documented contact with the Birch property over the preceding 2 years. These included the delivery driver from the restaurant supply wholesaler, 2 neighbors whose properties abutted the Birch parcel on the south side of MacArthur Road, and a rural utilities contractor who had performed electrical work at the property in the spring of 2024. The delivery driver had made 14 deliveries to the Birch property over 22 months. In his interview, he said Roland Birch always met him at the barn's side door. Birch paid in cash, counted out in advance, and never required the driver to enter the barn or the main structure. The driver said he'd never heard anything unusual during the deliveries. He'd noticed the volume of the orders was high for a rural residential account, but assumed it was a family operation of some kind. A large extended family, or perhaps a religious community. He didn't ask. The wholesaler didn't require him to ask. The 2 neighbors, an elderly couple on the adjacent parcel to the south, said in their interviews that they'd seen children at the Birch property on 2 occasions, both in the summer months, both briefly. They'd seen children in the yard near the barn, assumed they were visiting grandchildren, and hadn't thought further about it. Neither had spoken with Birch or his wife in several years. The property was set back far enough from the road that ordinary visual contact was limited. The electrical contractor's account was the most detailed. He'd been hired to upgrade the main electrical panel at the Birch property in April of 2024, a job that, given the utility draw the property was sustaining, had almost certainly been necessitated by the load the hidden room's climate control equipment was placing on the original panel. The contractor said, Birch had been present throughout the work and had accompanied him at all times, directing him away from the northwest section of the house, under the explanation that his wife was ill and resting. The contractor had had no reason to question this. He'd completed the panel upgrade, been paid in cash, and left. He hadn't been back to the property since. He hadn't filed any report. There was nothing in his interaction with the Birch household that, standing alone, would have prompted one. That's the texture of this kind of operation. No single interaction is alarming. No single contact produces a reason to act. The alarm only becomes visible when multiple data points are assembled together by someone who is specifically looking for the pattern. A fifth individual, identified in court documents only as an associate of Birch, was identified during the post-raid investigation phase as having made deliveries to the property on at least 6 separate occasions over a period of 18 months. That individual wasn't present at the property during the raid. As of the date of this reconstruction, they haven't been apprehended. A federal arrest warrant remains active. The supply chain investigation also surfaced the name of the restaurant supply wholesaler, whose customer records showed not 1, but 3 rural Ohio addresses receiving similar bulk quantity institutional food orders paid in cash. The other 2 addresses were searched by federal agents within 72 hours of the Birch raid. Both properties were occupied by adult residents only. No additional victims were found. But the investigation into the broader network of contacts those properties represented remained open. Investigators believed the Birch property wasn't isolated. It was one part of a larger network. What investigators still didn't know was how many other places like this may have existed. Here's what doesn't make sense on the surface. For over a year, the data that would have led investigators to that farmhouse sat in plain view in multiple county and state databases. The utility company had it. The county property records office had it. The school district enrollment system had it in the form of a conspicuous absence. None of those data points were connected to each other by any automated system. It took a mail carrier, a deputy's desk, a phone call, and a task force supervisor who thought to ask about utility bills. The investigation did surface one additional detail that hasn't received significant public attention. The thermal imaging run on the night of February 14th captured not only the 16 signatures clustered in the hidden room, it also captured a detail in the barn structure adjacent to the main house. A secondary heat signature cluster, smaller, in the northeast corner of the barn's upper level. The agents noted it. The warrant application covered the main structure. It didn't cover the barn. A supplemental warrant was obtained on February 18th. When agents searched the barn on February 19th, they found evidence of prior occupancy. Bedding, food packaging, personal items. But no current occupants. The barn space had been vacated. Recently. The implication was clear. The barn had been used in a similar capacity at some point in the past. How recently? For how long? By whom? Those questions remain open. The obstacle this created for prosecutors wasn't insignificant. Evidence of prior barn occupancy could suggest that the network had moved other individuals out of the Birch property before the investigation surfaced. Possibly tipped off by something as routine as the bulk supply deliveries being requested less frequently after the subpoena to the wholesaler. Prosecutors had to determine whether anyone with knowledge of the investigation had inadvertently telegraphed activity near the property. An internal review found no evidence of a leak. The working assumption is that the barn had been vacated well before the investigation began, possibly as long as 18 months prior. But the review couldn't close the question definitively. There's, in other words, a piece of this story that investigators haven't been able to fully account for. Federal task forces have become good at following financial networks and digital trails. What they can't easily detect is the void. The family that simply never registers. The children who never appear anywhere. The household that operates in a self-contained, cash-only, registration-free universe for years. That's the gap. And it's not a gap that more federal agents closes. The raid itself was over in under 90 minutes. The investigation wasn't. As of March 2026, all 16 children were placed into Ohio's child welfare system under emergency protective custody orders. The pediatric assessment process, conducted over multiple weeks, was described by the caseworkers involved as complex. The children had limited formal language. Several had developed communication patterns specific to the group. A partial Creole of English and invented vocabulary that worked within the group but was largely opaque to outside adults. Educational and developmental assessments were ongoing. Reunification wasn't immediately possible. Most had no legal identity. No birth records, no documentation, nothing to connect them to people outside the Birch house. Figuring out who they actually were, legally on paper, took longer than the raid itself. 3 of them had surnames that matched individuals in missing persons databases. 2 of those matches produced active missing persons cases that had been filed by family members. In both cases, the relevant families were notified within days of the raid. Those notifications, those phone calls to parents who had spent months not knowing, aren't described in any publicly available document. They're entirely off the record. What's on the record is a single line in the federal case summary filed with the court on March 22, 2026. 16 individuals, all minors, recovered. All alive. Those 3 words at the end carry more weight than the rest of the report. All alive. Now here's something to consider in the comments. Not about the verdict, not about the sentence. If you've ever driven past the same houses on the same rural road every single day, the way Patricia Voss did, would you have looked twice at those trash bins? She almost didn't. She almost drove past. She stopped because something was slightly off. Not wrong. Just slightly off. That's the margin. The federal prosecution moved forward on an accelerated docket. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Ohio filed a superseding indictment on April 8, 2026, adding charges related to the supply chain and the barn space evidence. Roland Birch's attorney entered a not guilty plea at arraignment. The 3 co-defendants entered similar pleas. Trial is currently scheduled for the fall of 2026. The investigation into the potential broader network, the other 2 rural addresses surfaced by the wholesale supply records, the unapprehended 5th individual, and the barn remained active under a separate case designation as of the date of this reconstruction. The Vinton County Sheriff's Department, following the raid, quietly began a review of similar rural property anomalies across the county. That review expanded in April to include 4 neighboring counties in the southeastern Ohio region. Investigators cross-referencing utility usage data, school enrollment gaps, and bulk supply delivery records across the expanded review area identified 11 additional properties warranting closer examination. As of the filing date of the last publicly available court document in the Birch case, 3 of those 11 properties had been cleared following voluntary consent searches. 8 remained under passive observation. The methodology Mercer's task force had assembled from a post-it note and a utility bill became, within weeks of the Birch raid, the basis for a regional review framework. The question of whether that framework would find anything remained unanswered. Patricia Voss returned to Route 12 the Monday after the raid. She wasn't named publicly at the time of the initial press coverage. She gave no interviews. She asked for no recognition. She finished her loop, same as every other day, past the same farms and the same fence corners. The farmhouse on the hill was sealed with federal crime scene tape. The mailbox was still there. It had been cleared of flyers by the evidence processing team. Empty. The trash bins at the end of the drive had been removed entirely. The Federal After Action Report's final summary section, filed April 2, 2026, closes with a standard operational assessment paragraph. Objectives achieved. Subjects secured. Victims recovered. Multi-agency coordination effective. Then, below the assessment, in a notation that is unusual for that type of document, Agent Rourke added a single supplemental line. Not required, not standard procedure, but not prohibited either. It reads, Subject asked if she was allowed to look at the sun. Recommend this notation be retained in the permanent case record as representative of the operational objective's human dimension. The federal magistrate who reviewed the final case file signed off on the notation's retention without comment. The network that produced the Birch property isn't fully mapped. The fifth individual remains at large. The barn's prior occupants haven't been identified. The question of how many children moved through that farmhouse over its full operational period, not just the 16 recovered on March 17th, hasn't been definitively answered. 16 were found. How many came before them is a question the prosecution hasn't yet closed. And the demand that created the Birch property, the demand that makes this kind of operation possible, sustainable, invisible, still exists. In Vinton County, in the counties adjacent to it, in every rural stretch of American geography where the distances are long, the records are thin, and the trash bins don't get checked. Patricia Voss had driven Route 12 for 11 years. She stopped once. Once was enough.